Well, welcome to HOA Today. I'm Mark Foster on the HOA Leadership Network. Well, Minnesota summer brings Minnesota storms, and of course, Mother Nature's brought her fair share of downpours and plenty of rain to the land of 10,000 lakes this year. And that means, of course, many properties in Minnesota, along with homeowner associations, are seeing the effects of stormwater and its aftermath. Here to discuss stormwater management for HOAs is Joe Barten. Joe is the owner of Stormwater Maintenance Professionals. Joe, thanks for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Mark. I'm very happy to be here.
So, Joe, let's start a little bit first about your background. Maybe tell us also a bit about your new company, Stormwater Maintenance Professionals.
How far back to go? I have a long history of doing landscaping and construction as a younger guy. Went to school at the University of Minnesota for environmental design, which is essentially landscape design and urban planning. And there I also studied sustainability and stormwater management. And I've worked for a number of different watershed management organizations, watershed districts, and did a lot of work surrounding stormwater management in urban areas. And I've met with tens, maybe even over hundreds of HOAs over the years. And I've gotten a really good feel for the different and specific issues that they deal with the kind of property they have. I noticed kind of over the years that there is this gap where there's not really specific companies. You have your landscaping companies, you have your property maintenance companies, and they can cut grass. They can take long grass and make it shorter. And sometimes you have companies that can do maintenance, on just general landscaping. But these stormwater practices require kind of an extra level of knowledge and knowledge of regulations and maintenance. So I formed this company, Stormwater Maintenance Professionals, and I've really enjoyed working with HOAs specifically.
Mhm.
And so basically, I'm trying to kind of fill that niche and offer that service.
Well, there's a lot of HOAs, as you know, in the metro area, so you'll be a busy guy. Thanks for the background. So let's get into it. So for people who are watching, so what exactly, Joe, is stormwater? How do you define it, and how does it relate to homeowner associations in Minnesota?
So stormwater broadly is, when we have rain, we get, anywhere between 30, 35 inches of rain here in Minnesota on average. And stormwater is really when it rains, that rain becomes stormwater when it hits the ground. And because we've developed all of our urban, suburban areas, we've created hard surface, right? We got our roads, we got our sidewalks, we have our houses, we have driveways, parking lots, buildings. All of these create stormwater runoff. So the water can't soak into the ground, right? Like it naturally did hundreds of years ago when there was no hard surface everywhere. So now what we have is more runoff. We have stormwater that accumulates in this very wonderful engineered system we have, right, of conveyance. So we've created curbs and gutters, we've created ditches, we've created this massive storm sewer system of also underground pipes that take the water away from structures, away from areas where we drive and live, but it has to go somewhere. So stormwater is really managing that rainwater in a way that is environmentally responsible and sensitive, but also is, not causing adverse effects like flooding or wet areas or problem areas on properties. So it's being able to think about not only the environmental impacts and minimizing them, but making a property useful and, fixing drainage solutions and finding drainage solutions as well.
Okay, so there's a history here of stormwater management. I'm sure that, like everything else, there's been an evolution, there's been changes to the process, there's been some improvements. So describe a bit for us, Joe. What are some of the progressive things that have occurred in terms of stormwater management in both urban and suburban areas?
So urban stormwater management probably really started getting going in the 70s with the Clean Water Act. And so it kind of filtered down from the federal to the state level in terms of regulations, and then now from the state level down to cities and counties, and how stormwater management is required in a lot of cases. So it wasn't always required. There's a lot of HOAs and properties that were developed, where all these houses and businesses were built and there was no stormwater management required. So they might be in a situation where if they want to redevelop their property, rebuild something, they might be required to now add stormwater management to protect downstream resources, lakes, rivers, and streams and wetlands. Or you might be in a situation where, I see this very frequently, maybe an HOA was built in the 80s or 90s and there was a pond. That was kind of the typical method of treating stormwater back 30 years ago, was to put in a pond. And it's an effective method, but a lot of times those ponds were kind of just installed and let go, and they weren't really paid attention to. And there's kind of just been a buildup of deferred maintenance on those areas. I see it very frequently where not just HOAs, but there's a property, and that property, 50% of it is covered by parking lots and buildings. 50% is covered by some kind of natural area, and maybe 10% of that is a stormwater pond. That stormwater, the grass, the 40% of the grass and the landscaping, that gets managed. It gets cut, it gets trimmed, it gets replaced. But that 10% of the stormwater area, people don't really know what to do with. And it sits there unmanaged for 20, 30 years.
Mhm.
And then they require maintenance, and just like anything, if you don't do regular maintenance, it's going to build up and it's going to be more costly in the long run.
Well, at the HOA Leadership Network at our meetings, our leaders are asking a lot of questions about this. There's a lot of concern about HOA properties, especially properties that are aging. I'm in one here in Lakeville that's about 25 years old, and we have that similar approach to stormwater, which is the pond or the trenching that occurs. And it seems like as we get more and more rain, we need to deal with this a little bit differently. So when you look at HOAs, Joe, in protecting the environment in particular, you've got not just summer storms, but obviously in the winter, we have escaped the last couple of years major snowstorms, or at least lots of major snowstorms. That's probably going to change, and we'll probably be back to it again with more typical snowfall. With that kind of approach, what are some of the things HOA should consider when it comes to stormwater management for the environment?
Yeah, I mean, stormwater, it's tied to a lot of different things. So it is being good stewards of your property and your land. And, part of that is trying to manage your own water so that it doesn't become part of a larger issue downstream. So doing that responsibly includes, taking care of your infrastructure. And part of that infrastructure is any existing stormwater features that you have on the property. That's during the summer. So it's also, stewardship can also just be, helping maintain your property values as well. And HOAs are really cognizant of that. So, you could have a stormwater practice on your property that has plants in it, and you want it to look good too. You don't want it to be an eyesore on your property. So regular maintenance can help it be something that's an attractive feature versus an eyesore. And then that's kind of, in the summer months, there's also drainage issues. So how do we rectify, the potential for not being able to use one area of your property because it's just wet all the time? Well, can we fix that in a way that's not going to cause any adverse effects to other neighbors or the stormwater system in general? And there's usually ways to do that. And then, in the wintertime, obviously that's a big consideration. So, there's other things like chloride is something that is more and more, I wouldn't say emerging. It's a well-known pollutant that we have in Minnesota because of how much we have to salt our roads. So, years ago, I used to plow snow a little bit in the wintertime when I was off for winter break during college. And I kind of understand how the plow drivers work. It's a tough job. You're out there in the middle of the night. It's hard to know what's going on. You have a really narrow window for when you have to clear the snow. But it's responsibly kind of maybe thinking about how you can store snow on your property. So where do you put that? Where is the snow storage areas? How do we be cognizant of that and thoughtful of that so when it does melt, it can have a chance to soak into the ground? And then also, how do we think about how we manage our properties for winter maintenance so that we're using the right amount of salt in the right place at the right time, and we're not overusing it unnecessarily. We are seeing, in water monitoring, there are elevated levels of chloride in our lakes and streams in Minnesota, and it doesn't really come out of the system. There's no stormwater practices that take salt out, right? It stays in our lakes and streams unless it gets flushed out in a big rain event.
Some of the HOAs that we hear, HOA board leaders that we hear from, talk about their native plants. A lot of common areas with native plants and the effect that some of these chemicals have and stormwater management in general. So what would you suggest, Joe, for HOAs that have native plants in terms of how to protect them and how to ensure they're part of a good stormwater management system?
Well, I think it's worthwhile to define a native plant first. So native plants are, we have some records based on, way before we did this public land survey. Before we had European settlement kind of take over the Midwest here, we kind of have an idea about in Minnesota what native plant communities were here. And then we can infer and we can look at records and we can look at existing areas that are more untouched. And we kind of have a pretty good idea of what kind of native plant species used to live in these areas. And there's a great map out there called the Marshner map, if you ever want to look it up. And so native plants, they've kind of become the standard for these natural areas, these stormwater best management practices, so that we're not putting in invasive species or non-natural plant species in these large stormwater facilities like ponds or the buffers surrounding ponds or natural areas or rain gardens. So the benefits of native plants is that they're well adapted to our environment. They don't need watering. They don't need to be babied to thrive in Minnesota here. And they also provide auxiliary benefits like pollinator habitat and just habitat to animals and other invertebrates that live in Minnesota and that we want to thrive. So you can kind of create these little pocket prairies in essence by utilizing native plants and promoting, the birds, bees, and butterflies to be able to thrive in our urban areas because they have habitat and they have food. The other benefit that native plants really provide, especially the native prairie plants, is they have these deep, deep fibrous root systems.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the goal of stormwater management is to soak water into the ground. And those roots actually help over time provide channels to get that water to help soak into the ground. So that's another big benefit of native plants is their deep fibrous root systems, soak water into the ground, and also prevent erosion on steeper slopes or on shorelines, for example.
All right, lots to consider, lots of great advice. We're talking with Joe Barten. He's the owner of Stormwater Maintenance Professionals, and we're going to talk next about rain gardens and their impact in this whole process after this quick break. If you're an HOA board member with a desire to stay on top of HOA issues, now's your chance to join the fastest growing education association in Minnesota, the HOA Leadership Network. Our mission is to support HOA leaders through education, collaboration, and research. There are 4 chapter locations in the metro area. Membership is free, and meetings are monthly. For the schedule near you and to join, visit HOALeadershipNetwork.com. All right, welcome back to HOA Today. I'm Mark Foster on the HOA Leadership Network. We're talking with Joe Barten. He's owner of Stormwater Maintenance Professionals here in the Twin Cities. So, Joe, let's talk a little bit more about ponds. You mentioned it at the beginning, but ponds seem to be one of the more common things that we see in HOAs. How should ponds be managed?
Just like any part of infrastructure, ponds are built with a specific purpose. They're very engineered. Sometimes ponds get kind of mixed up with lakes. Natural lakes, where usually stormwater ponds are an engineered part of infrastructure. And the intent of them is that stormwater flows in during a heavy rain, and then usually the pond water will bounce up. So the pond will actually fill up to a certain level, and then the water will kind of settle. And that allows the sediment and the phosphorus that's tied to the sediment to settle down into the bottom of the pond. So the ponds are actually meant and designed to fill up over time with sediment. That's their intent, with the goal that they capture the sediment so it doesn't get down to Crystal Lake or whatever nearby lake or stream you might find. So that's their function. They're meant to catch the bad stuff. So they're often full of algae, they're often green, and it's not uncommon for that to happen. So they do require maintenance. They roughly maybe have a 30-year lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
So once we start getting to that 20, 25, 30 years, we should start looking at, all right, how full are these ponds? Do we need to measure the sediment that's accumulated in the bottom of the pond to make sure it's still functioning as it should be?
Right.
So that's one consideration. We need to make sure the infrastructure, the pipe systems, the inlets and the outlets are functioning. They're not blocked. They're working just as they should. And then one of the more common and more frequent methods of maintenance too is just visual maintenance on vegetation. So let's make sure that this thing has adequate vegetation so that there's no erosion around the edges of the pond, and then aesthetically so that it looks good, so that it can be as much of an amenity to the people that live around.
Yeah, land of 10,000 lakes and land of 100,000 ponds. I get that. Lots of ponds on HOA properties. So rain gardens, they seem to be more and more common. We put a rain garden in here in Lakeville in our HOA. So talk about rain gardens, Joe. What do residents need to know about them?
Yeah. So rain gardens, I would say they've been steadily increasing as a method to treat stormwater for, 20 plus years. And so we have some pretty good data on them. There's a number of studies done by universities, by states that show the benefits of rain gardens. So in comparison to something like a pond is going to take, let's just picture one development, an HOA property with um, 50 units on it. And a pond is usually you're going to just have one pond that handles all that stormwater kind of at like an end of the pipe solution, right? So all the water that comes from all the streets and all the houses is going to go to one pond at the end, and then it'll leave the property. So that can only capture so much of the pollutants through that settling out of the pond. So rain gardens are kind of a little bit more of a front end solution where we were trying to capture smaller drainage areas throughout the property and then soak them into the ground completely so
Mhm.
that the soil is acting as a natural filter and you can catch a lot more pollutants if you're doing a smaller drainage area. And the goal is to soak everything into the ground, use it as a sponge, replenish aquifers, versus where a pond is the end of the pipe solution and it's only going to be able to capture so much of the nutrients. And it's really not helping, it's not soaking any water into the ground if it's
Yeah.
functioning properly.
Now, there's certainly other natural areas within HOAs. How do they serve for stormwater management?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of times, there's different methods, and that kind of depends on the municipality or the city and when the property was developed. I've seen different properties where for some reason, the developer was required to retain a certain amount of natural area on the property, and that's kind of turned into the part of the property, the part of the HOA that nobody mows, right? And maybe you get some trees or buckthorn that come in there over time that make it kind of an unkempt area and isn't very aesthetically pleasing. So natural areas, just like anything, require maintenance to kind of be in these urban areas, especially to be an attractive piece of the property. They could also be buffers. So they might be a buffer on a drainage pathway or a drainage area, or it could be a buffer on an existing wetland or
Mhm.
an existing lake or stream that you have on the property. And when I say buffer, I just mean, a width of natural native vegetation that's intended to capture some pollutants from stormwater before it gets to that water resource of concern.
Well, I guess that brings me to my last question. It seems like there are some things that HOAs can do that are sort of a nice to have, and there might be some other things that are required. Can you just very briefly define what is required among HOAs in all of this process?
In my years of work, I've worked with enough lawyers that I've gotten used to this response when I ask them questions. And the question I'll ask some kind of question, and the response I often get is, well, it depends. Right? So a lot of it depends. And in this case, it usually depends most on the city. So again, there's these umbrella stormwater requirements and regulations that come down from the state, which is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, is kind of the regulating authority. And then they actually have the cities apply for and submit information for something that's called an MS4 permit. MS4, I'm going to go in the weeds a little bit, stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System permit. So the cities are required to have this permit that has to do with stormwater management. They have a number of criteria. And one of those criteria is for them to, manage the private stormwater BMPs. But cities have a little bit of leeway in how they can do that. So one of the parts of this is, you need to have a thorough understanding and be able to talk with the city and look at city code to understand within each city what is required. It also might come down to property ownership. Some areas you might have within an HOA a piece of land or a pond that's actually managed by the city. Or in other HOAs, even just next door, if they were built, 15 years apart, that HOA pond might be completely the responsibility of the HOA. So property ownership is a big one. And then what municipality you live in is a big one that kind of dictates, number one, what's required as far as regular maintenance, reporting, maybe sampling of sediment. And then the other thing would be just what's nice to do kind of comes down to the HOA itself. And what do they want this thing to look like? Do they value it as an amenity? Do they really want to enhance pollinator habitat in a certain area or around the entire pond?
Well, we've certainly heard from our HOA leaders in our network that there are a variety of issues that everyone is dealing with, and I'm sure they'll appreciate all of your great insights and opinions. And we appreciate you being on. Joe Barten, owner of Stormwater Maintenance Professionals. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much for having me, Mark.
Yep, it's great to see you. So, if you are an HOA leader and you'd like to be part of our network, it is free. Go to our website at www.hoalnet.com and join. Membership is free. For HOA Today, I'm Mark Foster, and this is the HOA Leadership Network.